Hey guys, I just want to rant a bit, and I also want to draw a few threads together regarding general reactionary ways of thinking, and it's mostly because I've been having a conversation with someone on a Steve Shives video, and I want to talk about some of the things they said, mostly because I feel like it highlights a few glaring problems with mostly MRAs, although I will go into something else a bit here. So, firstly, one of the big problems with the way this person argued is that they kept avoiding the question. I'll come back to that in a bit, but the basics of it is something I see MRAs do a lot, is they will make a specific statement, like, I'll give an analogy of something, well actually I'll give the analogy they did say. So they said, Anita Sarkeesian supports banning certain games, and that was their statement. And I engaged them and basically said, do you have any evidence, because I have not seen any evidence to suggest that she does support banning certain games. And they began talking about loads of irrelevant issues. They began talking about how the media supports her, about questioning her, how her assessment of games is invalid. They also bring up another point, which is a point that I also thought was stupid, which I'll get into. And in the broadest sense, it can go right down to the fundamental, you're trying to have a conversation with someone about feminism or a specific issue of feminism, and when they lose the argument there, they suddenly turn it into a big, discussion about fundamental feminist theory, which is of course annoying, because usually it's quite easy to have a discussion on one specific topic, but if the person then brings it back to discussing the entire foundations of individual philosophies or theories or things like that, then you're going to have that topic. So what I try and do there is basically say, shut the fuck up, don't bring up irrelevant theories. We're not here to discuss every aspect of feminist theory, we're here to discuss the specific statement you made. Now, another thing I see this with a lot of the time is anarcho-capitalists, because I like to try and have conversations, I guess I could say libertarians, but mostly anarcho-capitalists. I try and have conversations with them, and, conversations a lot of the time aren't even adversarial. Like one time I went on the anarcho-capitalist subreddit, and I posted basically something asking what they think about the idea that left anarchists and anarcho-capitalists can work together. And while I did get a few legitimate responses, a lot of the time they would then, when I said things like, what do you think about the fact that many left anarchists would say this in response to your idea that whatever, about how the two could work together, it would inevitably dissolve into them just saying, talking about how they disagree with anarchist property theory, or talking about how they disagree with what one specific anarchist said or something like that. And it's the best term I can think of for it is it's sectarian. Like, you want to have a discussion about an issue, but for MRAs and anarcho-capitalists, they inevitably turn it into having a debate between two sides, which gets on my nerves. It's like, because like I say, it then just brings the whole conversation into discussing the fundamental differences between two ideas, and if every conversation you have goes back to discussing the fundamental differences between two ideas, you are never going to have a productive conversation. You're just going to have that same conversation over again, because, unless you're able to agree on the fundamental difference between two ideas and then still have time to move on to a bigger issue, chances are you're not going to be able to. So I'm going to talk a bit about this claim that Anita Sarkeesian supports banning video games, and it's something I talked about a bit when I did the hangout with Captain Andy, which I will link to, which is the idea that criticizing video games means you support banning video games, or criticizing video games means that you support banning free speech. Now, presumably if you hold free speech in high esteem, then you believe it should not be allowed that other people, you know, directly contradict free speech. I mean, that's what I would assume. If you hold free speech in high regard, you think it should not be allowed that other people take away your free speech. So, if you define criticizing video games as taking away your free speech, then what you're basically saying is Anita Sarkeesian shouldn't be allowed to criticize video games. So, ironically, you are claiming other people shouldn't be allowed to speak their mind because you think it means you're not allowed to speak your mind. So if you ever make the statement Anita Sarkeesian is against free speech because she said that video games should be more representative or whatever else, then you're basically saying you don't think Anita Sarkeesian should be allowed to say that video games should be more representative. So it's a complete fail from the word go. Now the other thing I wanted to talk about was, I guess I wanted to sort of talk about three things. The other thing the person said is video games, they started talking about video games causing violence, which I think is a bit of a different issue to whether or not video games cause sexism, because sexism can be very subconscious. But they said video games don't cause violence because video games have obviously increased as a form of media in the last 2 decades or so, and yet in Western countries domestic violence, or sorry I should say, when I use the term domestic I mean as opposed to international, so internal violence within Western countries has gone down in the last 20 years. And the person said this proves that video games don't cause violence, and of course this is a false argument, and the example I used is that life expectancy has increased in the last few years, and yet obesity has increased in the last few years. Does that mean that obesity causes health or or longer life expectancy? And of course this is basic statistics, but you see MRAs make this mistake all the time. They say, if X causes violence or X causes misogyny, then how is it that this thing hasn't gone up? It's just really dumb. But I bring this up just to make my third point, bring everything together, which is that I do not think that video games have caused violence, and this is both connected to the whole sectarian thing, as well as being connected to just general idiocy, and here the idiocy isn't necessarily exclusive to MRAs and libertarians, because there's a really good example of the first time I ever saw this idiotic anti-intellectual attitude at play was when Philosophy Lines made a video. And basically what happened is Lawrence Strauss said homosexuals aren't immoral because sheep are homosexual, sheep show homosexual acts, or do homosexual acts and show homosexual desires, and sheep are not immoral. So they were basically, Krauss was basically making the argument that animals don't have moral agency, therefore they're not immoral, but animals do certain things, and therefore those actions cannot be immoral, which is obviously a terrible argument, because we know that animals rape regularly. And if you want to, for example, a meteor or a comet doesn't have moral agency, and a meteor or a comet can wipe out millions of life forms and potentially millions of people. Now, just because the comet isn't immoral for wiping out millions of people because a comet doesn't have moral agency, does it follow that wiping out millions of people isn't immoral? And, so basically, Philosophy Lines was pointing out this argument doesn't really make any sense. You can't argue that just because something occurs in nature and is performed by organisms without moral agency, it therefore follows that that action isn't immoral. And, this argument is completely true. or completely, you know, it's a very good counter-argument. But, of course, because he was arguing against a pro-homosexuality argument, or a, you know, pro-LGBT argument, nobody wanted to accept that the argument was complete bogus. And he even says, you know, I agree with Lawrence Krauss's conclusions. I agree that homosexuality isn't immoral, but we should criticize bad arguments, even if they lead to conclusions that we ourselves hold. And in this case, and this goes back to the sectarian thing. You know, if someone's disagreeing with your argument, they must automatically be on the opposite side, which is false. You know, it's almost goes without saying. And in this case, I don't think that video games cause people to be violent. But I think the argument being presented by this person was a really poor argument, because it was basically a correlation equals causation argument. And yet they kept saying, no matter how many times I told them I agreed with them, that video games don't cause violence, and I'm just taking issue with that, the structure of their argument, not the conclusion of their argument. They kept accusing me of thinking video games cause violence. And, you know, all of these things are just such warped ways of thinking, and it's kind of staggering. And if it wasn't for the fact that I can appreciate that this is usually just idiots on the internet, it's the type of thing that almost makes me go, oh, Stefan Molyneux with the whole, oh, philosophy's crumbling apart. Obviously, in philosophy there still is actual people who have academic rigour, but the number of people who are just lay philosophers that make such basic errors, like not being able to appreciate the difference between disagreeing with an argument and disagreeing with the conclusion of that argument, is a real shame. And it's something that I do see more often. I guess you could argue perhaps because I argue more often with people on the opposite side, but it is the type of thinking, I guess, it's the type of thinking that is very particular to the internet, where people are given a forum to discuss things that they maybe do not have the knowledge or the training to discuss. And the internet does seem to harbour a lot of these weird groups that usually wouldn't get an actual podium to stand on. But anyway, I just thought I'd rant about that for a while, so thank you.